Welcome everyone, welcome to this comprehensive course of moral reasoning offered by London College of International Studies. My name is Dr. Mohammed Louishi and I'll be your guide through this fascinating exploration of ethical thinking. Over the next 3 hours, we're going to embark on the intellectual journey that will transform how you think about right and wrong, how you analyze literature, and how you engage with the complex ethical challenges of everyday life. This course is designed specifically for English students, but the skills you develop here will serve you throughout your academic career and beyond. Before we begin, let me give you an overview of what we will cover today. We've organized this session in 4 main parts, each building on the previous one, so that by the end you will have a comprehensive understanding of moral reasoning and how to apply it in your studies and life. Course outline. Let me look at our roadmap for today. We have 4 major sections to explore. First, we'll examine why moral reasoning matters for English students. You might be wondering why I am learning about ethics in English course. This section will answer that question convincingly. We will discover that literature and ethics are deeply intertwined and that developing moral reasoning skills will actually make you a better reader, writer, and critical thinker. Second, we will tackle the foundational question: what is moral reasoning? We need to establish a clear definition and understand what makes moral reasoning distinct from other types of thinking. We'll explore the core principles that guide ethical thought across different cultures and philosophical traditions. Third, we will dive into moral reasoning in literature and texts. This is where theory meets practice for English students. We'll see how stories serve as laboratories for ethical exploration and how analyzing the moral dimensions of texts enriches our literary understanding. Finally, we'll focus on developing your moral reasoning skills. This isn't just about learning theory, it's about building practical capabilities you can use immediately. We'll explore concrete strategies and exercises to strengthen your ethical thinking. Each section builds logically on the previous one, so even if some concepts seem challenging at first, they will become clearer as we progress. Don't hesitate to take notes and remember, moral reasoning is a skill that improves with practice. Moral reasoning, thinking ethically in everyday life. Now let's begin with our central theme: moral reasoning, thinking ethically in everyday life. Welcome to an exploration of how we navigate the complex ethical landscapes of our lives. Notice I said navigate because ethical thinking isn't about finding people answers or memorizing rules. It's about developing the tools to find your way through complicated moral terrain. Think about your own life for a moment. How many times this week have you faced a situation where you had to decide what was the right things to do? Maybe it was something small. Should you tell a friend an uncomfortable truth or spare their feelings? Or maybe it was something bigger. How should you respond in injustice you witness? These everyday moments are filled with moral reasoning, even when we don't consciously recognize it. Throughout this course, we'll examine the framework that guide our moral decisions. These frameworks aren't arbitrary. They systematic ways of thinking that philosophers have developed over millennia. We will analyze ethical dilemmas in literature and society, connecting the stories we read to real world's moral challenges, and most importantly, we will develop the critical thinking skills needed to approach difficult questions with both clarity and compassion. Notice that combination, clarity and compassion, good moral reasoning isn't cold and calculating, nor it's purely emotional. It integrates our rational capabilities with our capacity for empathy. This integration is what makes moral reasoning such a powerful tool for English students who work consistently with texts that explore human experience in all its complexity. Moral reasoning, thinking ethically in everyday life. So why we study moral reasoning? Because it matters. So bridging literature and ethics, the stories we read and analyze English courses aren't just entertainment. Their exploration of human choices, consequences, and values, from Hamlet's moral paralyzed to Attic's Finch's unwavering principles, literature provides a rich landscape for examining ethical questions by developing moral reasoning skills. You will read more deeply, analyzing not just what characters do, but why they make their choices and what those choices reveal about human nature. So let's go there, bridging literature and ethics. Let's explore this connection more deeply. How exactly do literature and ethics connect? The stories we read and analyze in English courses aren't just entertainment, they're profound exploration of human choices, consequences, and values. Every compelling narrative is at its heart an ethical investigation. Think about some of the classics you may have encountered or will encounter in your studies. Consider Hamlet. The entire play revolves around moral paralysis, the question of where and how to seek revenge, the ethics of action versus inaction. Hamlet's famous soliloquy, to be or not to be, isn't just physical music amusing. It's a deep ethical struggle about the value of life, the nature of suffering, and the moral obligation. Or consider Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. His character is defined by unwavering moral principles. He defends Tom Robinson not because it's easy to or popular, but because it's right. His consistency in applying moral principles regardless of social pressure makes him one of literature's most admired characters. Literature provides a rich landscape for examining ethical questions because it shows us not just what characters do, but why they make their choices and what those choices reveal about human nature. When you read with attention to moral reasoning, you're not just asking what happened, but why did this character choose this action? What principles guided them? What would I have done? What should they have done? Now let's go for the second one, developing critical thinking. Beyond enhancing literature analysis, moral reasoning develops critical thinking skills that are absolutely essential for academic success. Here is a powerful insight. Moral reasoning demands rigorous analysis, evaluation, and logical consistency. The exact same skills required for literary analysis and academic writing. When you practice ethical thinking, you simultaneously strengthen your capacity for all academic work. Let me be specific about this connection. When you construct a moral argument, you must state a clear position, provide evidence and reasoning to support it, consider alternative perspectives, address counter arguments, maintain logical consistency throughout, draw reasonable conclusions. Notice something. This is exactly the structure of a strong ethical essay. When you write about literature, you follow the same process. You make a claim about text, support it with textual evidence, consider alternative interpretations, and build a coherent argument. The skills transfer directly as you practice ethical thinking. You will strengthen your ability to construct sound arguments, recognize logical fallacies, and approach complex problems methodically. You'll become better at identifying when someone's reasoning is flawed, whether in a text you're analyzing, an argument you're evaluating, or even on your own thinking. These transferable skills make you not just better English students, but a more capable thinker in every domain. You'll write more persuasive essays, analyze texts with greater depth, and participate more effectively in academic courses, academic discourse, all core components of English students and English studies. Engaging with diverse perspectives. Another crucial reason moral reasoning matters for English students is that it equips you to engage thoughtfully with diverse perspectives. Literature exposes us to viewpoints and experiences radically different from our own. You might read about characters from different cultures, historical periods, social classes, or value systems. Without moral reasoning skills, we might simply judge these characters by our own contemporary standards, missing the richness of what the text offers. Moral reasoning equips you to engage thoughtfully with these diverse perspectives. It helps you understand the value and assumptions that shape different worldviews. You learn to ask, why might someone from this culture or time period see this situation differently than I do? What principles are guiding their thinking, even if I disagree with their conclusions? Can I understand the reasoning that led them here? This capacity for perspective talking and empathetic understanding is essential for meaningful cross-cultural communication in our increasingly interconnected world. The ability to understand and engage respectfully with people who hold different values is not just academically useful. It's necessary for functioning in diverse societies. For your writing, the skill is invaluable. When you can genuinely understand the multiple perspectives, you create more thoughtful, inclusive writing that resonates with diverse audiences. Your analysis becomes more nuanced, your argument more sophisticated, and your thinking more mature. This doesn't mean abandoning your own values or accepting moral relativism. It means developing the intellectual flexibility to understand different ethical frameworks while still maintaining your own reasoning positions. Beyond academic benefits, while the academic benefits of moral reasoning are significant, they're only part of the story. The skills you develop here extend far beyond your English classes. Beyond academic benefits, moral reasoning helps you develop as a thoughtful, engaged citizen capable of navigating complex ethical terrain in your personal and professional life. Think about the ethical challenges you'll face decisions about your career, your relationships, your civic responsibilities, how you use these resources, how you treat others. The language skills you develop in English studies become powerful tools for articulating and examining ethical positions. You'll be able to express your values clearly, understand others' moral arguments, analyze ethical debates in media and politics, and contribute meaningfully to conversations about social issues. In your future careers, whatever field you enter, you'll face ethical challenges. Well, you know how to organize them. Will you have frameworks for thinking them through? Will you able to articulate your reasoning to others? There aren't hypothetical skills. They are practical capabilities that will serve you throughout your life. Moreover, moral reasoning contributes to personal integrity and well begin when when you can think clearly about your values and make decisions aligned with them. You experience less, more confusing, and greater sense of purpose. You're better equipped to resist social pressure when it conflicts with your principles, and you're more likely to live in ways that reflect who you truly want to be. So, what is more moral reasoning definition? So, now that we understand why moral reasoning matters, let's define exactly what we mean by this term. Moral reasoning is a process by which we determine right and wrong actions through rational deliberation. Let me break down this definition carefully because each part is important. First, is a process. Moral reasoning isn't a single moment of judgment, but an ongoing practice of thinking through ethical questions. It's active, deliberate, and systematic. Second, we're determining right and wrong actions. The moral reasoning is ultimately practical. It's not just theoretical speculation. It's meant to guide what we actually do. Third, we do this through national deliberation. This is crucial. Moral reasoning is distinct from gut feelings, emotional reactions, or examined assumptions. It involves conscious, thoughtful analysis. Unlike instinctive emotional responses or personal preferences, more reasoning involves throughout analysis guided by principles, duties, or values. When you feel angry about injustice, that's an emotional response. When you analyze why it's unjust, what principles it violates, and what would be just alternative, that's moral reasoning. This isn't mean emotional are irrelevant to ethics. Our moral emotional emotions often alert to us to ethical issues and motivate us to care about them. But moral reasoning asks us to be to go beyond initial emotional reactions to examine the principles and reasoning that should guide our reasons and our responses. Personal preferences also differ from moral judgments. If I prefer chocolate to vanilla, that's a preference. There is no right or wrong about it. But if I believe it's wrong to steal, I'm making a moral claim that I believe should apply to everyone, not just to me. Moral reasoning helps us distinguish these different types of judgments. Defining characters of moral reasoning. So, to understand moral reasoning more fully, let's examine its defining characters and the defining characteristics. These features distinguish genuine moral reasoning from other types of thinking or judgment. First, moral reasoning involves systematic thinking about moral questions rather than mere opinion or preference. It's structured and methodical, not haphazard haphazard, sorry, not haphazard. You don't just assert what you believe. You examine the reasons and the principles behind your beliefs. Second, moral reasoning aims to be impartial, considering the interests and rights of all affected parties. This is challenging because we naturally care more about ourselves and those close to us. But moral reasoning asks, what if I were in the other person's position? How would I want to be treated? Am I giving equal consideration to everyone affected by this decision? Third, moral reasoning requires coherence and consistency in applying moral principles. If you judge an action as wrong in one situation, you must judge similar actions as wrong in similar situations. You can't make arbitrary exceptions for yourself or people you like. Fourth, moral reasoning distinguishes between relevant and irrelevant factors in making moral judgments. Not everything about situation matters morally. For example, whether someone is wealthy or poor might be relevant to judgments about their moral obligations, but whether they're tall or short is not. Learning to identify which differences matter morally is a key skill. Finally, moral reasoning seeks to resolve conflicts between competing moral claims or values. Often we face situations where multiple moral considerations pull in different directions. Good moral reasoning helps us think through these tensions systematically rather than simply following our gut instincts. Distinctions from other forms of reasoning. To fully understand moralism, we need to distinguish it from other types of reasoning. This comparison chart shows four different types of reasoning and their primary concerns. Moral reasoning is concerned with what we ought to do. It's evaluative and prescriptive. When we engage in moral reasoning, we are asking, what should I do, or what the right course of action there are. These are normative questions about how we should behave. Scientific reasoning, by contrast, seeks to describe and explain natural phenomena. It's descriptive. Scientists ask what is or how does this work, not what should we do about it. Science can inform moral decisions by providing facts, but it can't tell us what's right or wrong. For example, science can tell us that climate change is happening and explain its mechanisms, but deciding what we ought to do about it requires moral reasoning. Practical reasoning is focused on effective means to achieve goals regardless of moral worth. It answers the question, how can I accomplish X? For example, if your goal is to become wealthy, practical reasoning might tell you that investing into rand stocks or starting a business would be effective, but it doesn't evaluate whether the goal itself is morally worthy or whether the means are ethical. Aesthetic reasoning is connected with with beauty taste and artistic value. When we debate whether a poem is beautiful or whether a painting succeeds artistically, we are engaged in aesthetic rather than moral reasoning. Of course, sometimes moral and aesthetic considerations intersect. For instance, when we question whether art that glorifies violence is ethically problematic, but they remain distinct types of evaluation. Understanding these distinctions helps us recognize when we are truly engaged in moral reasoning versus other forms of thought. More on distinctions, let's deepen our understanding of what makes moral reasoning unique. So, unlike philosophical reasoning, which primarily seeks explanation and understanding of abstract concepts, moral reasoning is fundamentally practical. It guides our actions and decisions in real-world situations. The philosophy certainly informs moral reasoning, but moral reasoning is ultimately about deciding what to do, not just about understanding concepts. Think about the difference this way. A philosopher might explore the abstract concept of justice, examining different theories and definitions. That's valuable philosophical work, but when you face a specific situation where you must decide whether to report a friend's cheating or remain silent, you need moral reasoning, practical, ethical thinking that leads to action. Moral reasoning helps us navigate complex ethical terrain where our in intuitions might be unclear or conflicting. Sometimes our gut feelings about what's right conflict with each other, or we feel uncertain about difficult cases. Moral reasoning provides the frameworks and the principles to work through this complexity systematically. This practical orientation is why moral reasoning is so valuable. It's not just intellectual exercise, it's a tool for living better lives and making better decisions. Then relevance for English students. So now let's bring this specifically back to your studies as English students. For English students, moral reasoning provides a framework for analyzing the ethical dimensions of texts, understanding character motivations, and evaluate the moral messages embedded in literature. When you read a novel, play, or poem with moral reasoning skills, you can analyze questions like what ethical framework guides this character's decision? How does the author present different moral perspectives? What values does this text implicitly endorse or critic? How do characters develop morally throughout the narrative? Moral reasoning also informs how we use language responsibly and ethically in our own communication. As students who work with words, you have power. The power is persuade to represent others, to shape how issues are understood. With this power comes the responsibility. Moral reasoning helps us think about questions like how should I represent perspectives different from my own? What's my ethical obligation to accuracy and fairness in my writing? How can I make persuasive arguments without manipulating readers? Throughout this course, we will develop both the analytical tools for moral reasoning and the linguistic skills to express ethical arguments clearly and persuasively. These complementary skills will make you more effective as readers, writers, thinkers, and communicators. Then the two core principles of moral reasoning. Now we are ready to examine the foundation of moral reasoning. As the foundation of moral reasoning lie two fundamental principles that guide ethical thinking across diverse philosophical traditions. These aren't principles from one particular ethical theory or cultural tradition. They're core principles that appear in nearly every systematic approach to ethics, whether you are examining Western philosophy, Eastern traditions, religious ethics, or secure frameworks, you will find these principles at work. These principles provide the essential framework for consistent and fair moral judgment. They're tools that help us think clearly about ethical questions and avoid common errors in moral reasoning. Once you understand and internalize these principles, you'll have a foundation for ethical thinking that applies across countless specific situations. Let's examine each principle carefully. The consistency principle, the first core principle is the consistency principle. Similar cases should be treated similarly. This principle demands that we apply our moral judgment consistently across comparable situations. If we judge an action as wrong in one context, we should judge similar actions as wrong in similar contexts, regardless of our personal interests or relationships. Let me give you a concrete complex. Suppose you believe it's wrong for your roommate to borrow your laptop without asking. The consistency principle um, require that you also believe it's wrong for you to borrow your roommate laptop without asking. You can't make an exception for yourself just because you are you. Or consider a more complex example. If you believe a company acts unethically by exploiting workers in one country, consistency requires that you judge similar exploitation wrong when any company does it, even if it is a company you generally admire or benefit from. This might sound obvious, but in practice, we frequently violate the consistency principle. We make excuses for ourselves, our friends, or our political allies or groups we identify with, while applying stricter standards to others. The consistency principle challenges us to examine whether we are truly being fair or just favoring our own interests. The consistency principle is closely related to the concept of universality, the idea that moral rules must apply to everyone equally, including ourselves. This concept is central to many ethical frameworks, particularly Kantian ethics. While we explore later, Kant argued that we should act only according to maxims that we could well to become universal laws. In other words, principles we'd accept if everyone followed them. Uh, the relevant differences principle. The second core principle is equally important, the relevant differences principle. This principle states that different judgments require relevant moral differences. When we make different moral judgments about seemingly similar cases, we must be able to identify morally relevant differences between them. Not all differences matter morally, only those that relate to recognized ethical values or principles. Let me illustrate this with an example. Suppose two students cheat on an exam. One is wearing a red shirt, the other a blue shirt. If we punish one more harshly than the other, a difference is shirt color is not a morally relevant distinction. It has nothing to do with the ethical wrongness of cheating. However, imagine that one student cheated because they were unprepared and wanted a better grade, while the other cheated because they have a learning disability and couldn't get proper accommodations. This difference in circumstances might be morally relevant. It relates to factors like fairness, need, and systematic justice. This principle prevents arbitrary or biased moral judgments based on irrelevant factors like personal preference, social status, race, gender, or wealth. It forces us to examine whether the differences we're pointing to actually matter ethically. Consider another example. Is there a moral relevant difference between lying to protect someone from serious harm versus lying to avoid minor embarrassment? Yes, the magnitude of consequences and the purpose of the deception are morally relevant factors. But what about lying to a friend versus lying to a stranger? That's more debatable. Some ethical frameworks consider relationships morally relevant, others do not. The point is that we must articulate and defend why we think a difference matters morally. This principle requires careful thinking. It's not always obvious which difference are morally relevant, and people can reasonably disagree. But the principle demands that we engage in this analysis rather than making arbitrary distinction. The two principles working together. Together, these principles ensure that moral reasoning is both consistent and nuanced. They work in tandem to guide our ethical thinking. They prevent us from making arbitrary exceptions for ourselves or those we favor, while still allowing for conceptual judgment that recognizes morally significant differences between situations. Think of it this way: the consistency principle prevents us from being hypocritical or biased. It ensures we apply the same standards across the board, but taking alone consistency could lead to rigid context implying judgment that treat genuinely different situations the same way. That's where the relevant differences principle comes in. It allows us to make judgments that recognize meaningful distinctions while preventing us from using trivial or prejudiced differences to justify unfair treatment. These principles create a system of checks and balances in our moral reasoning. When you are tempted to make an exception, the consistency principle asks, are you really being fair here? When you notice differences between cases, relevant differences, uh, principle asks, do those differences actually matter morally? For example, consider punishment. The constancy principle says we should punish similar crimes similarly, but relevant differences principle allows us to consider factors like intent, circumstances, prior history, and the potential for rehabilitation, factors that genuinely matter to questions of justice and fairness, or consider obligations to help others. The consistency principle prevents us from helping only those who look like us or other share our background, but the relevant differences principles allows us to recognize that we may have special obligations to family members or people we've made commitments to, because those relationships create morally relevant differences in our duties. Um, Applying these principles in practice, let's see how these principles work in everyday moral reasoning with A concrete example, consider if I believe it's wrong for someone to break a promise to me, then by consistency principle, I must also believe it's wrong for me to break some promises to others. I can't have one standard for how others should treat me and different standard for how I treat them. This seems straightforward, and most people would agree in the abstract, but noticed how we often violate this in practice. We feel genuinely wronged when someone breaks a promise to us, but we sometimes break a promise to others while telling others ourselves it's not that serious, or we had good reasons. However, if I believe breaking a promise is justified in one case but not another, the relevant differences principle requires me to identify the morally relevant factor that distinguishes the two cases. What might constitute morally relevant differences? Perhaps one promise was extracted through deception or uh, coercion. That would be relevant because consent matters to moral obligations. Perhaps keeping one promise would cause serious harm. For instance, if you promise to keep a location secret, but then learn someone there is in danger, the principle of preventing serious harm might outweigh the obligations to keep the promise. Or perhaps one promise was relatively trivial. You promised to call someone but forgot, while another was serious. You promised to complete your part of the group project. The stakes and the harm caused by breaking the promise are morally relevant factors. The key is that you must be able to articulate these differences and explain why they matter. Morally, you can just say, well, my situation was different without specifying what the difference was and why it's ethically significant. This kind of reasoning requires intellectual honesty and self awareness. It's easier to recognize when others are making arbitrary exceptions than to catch ourselves doing it. Hmm. Tools for English students. For English students, these principles provide a powerful analytical tool for examining ethical conflicts in literature and for constructing sound moral arguments in your own writing. When you're analyzing a text, these principles help us to ask probing questions. Is this character applying consistent moral standards, or are they being hypocritical when they treat different people differently? What difference do they point to, and are those differences morally relevant? How does the text itself judge characters who violate consistency? For example, in analyzing The Merchant of Venice, you might examine how Shylock is treating differently from other characters and whether the differences used to justify this treatment, his religion, his occupation, are portrayed as morally relevant or as prejudice. When you're writing analytical or argumentative essays, these principles strengthen your reasoning. They help you ensure your arguments and consist, and that when you make distinctions between cases, you can clearly articulate why those distinctions matter. These principles move you beyond the simplistic moral judgments to more ethical analysis. Instead of just saying this character is bad, you can analyze the principles they violate, the inconsistencies in their reasoning, or the moral irrelevant factors influencing their judgment. Fairness requires consistency. Introduction. Let's explore more deeply how these principles connect to our fundamental sense of fairness. The concept of fairness sits at the heart of moral reasoning. When we speak of fairness, we are often involving the consistency principles, the idea that similar cases deserve similar treatment. Think about when you felt something was unfair. Often it's because you perceived inconsistent treatment. Someone else got away with something you were punished for. One person received an advantage while others in similar situations didn't. Rules applied differently to different people without good reason. This principle transcends cultural boundaries and appears in ethical frameworks worldwide. Whether you examine Western philosophy, African ethics, confusion through thought, Confucian thought, Islamic jurisprudence, or indigenous moral traditions, you'll find versions of this principle. The specific applications may vary across cultures, but the core insight that fairness requires treatment or treating similar cases similarly appears nearly universally. This universality suggested that the consistency principle connects to something fundamental about human moral, psychological, and social cooperation. Societies cannot function if rules apply arbitrarily. Trust breaks down when people cannot predict how they will be treated based on their actions. The foundation of justice. From childhood, we develop a keen sense of when exceptions are being made unfairly. That's not fair is often one of the first moral objections children learn to express. Think about children on a playground. Even very young children notice and protest when rules seem to apply differently to different people. When one child is allowed to break the rules but another is punished for the same behavior, children immediately recognized this and just as just, even if they cannot fully articulate why. This initiative recognition reflects our understanding that arbitrary differences in treatment undermine the very concept of justice. Injustice isn't just about rules existing, it's about rules being applied consistently and fairly. As Aristotle noted over 2 millennia ago, equals should be treated equally, and unequally in proportion to relevant differences. This formulation captures both core principles of moral reasoning, consistency, and relevant differences. Notice in Aristotle's principle, it's not just to treat everyone exactly the same. That would be simplistic and potentially unjust. Instead, it's treat equally equals. I mean, treat equals equally. Consistency and unequals unequally in proportion to relevant differences, recognition that some differences matter morally. For instance, in education, fairness doesn't necessarily mean giving every student exactly the same instruction. A student with learning disability might need different accommodations than one without. But this different treatment is justified by a relevant difference. The students' different needs and the difference in treatment is proportional to that need. This ancient principle remains foundational to our modern concepts of justice, from legal systems to institutional policies to personal ethics. Consistency and literary ethics. These principles of consistency appear prominently in literature, where characters are often defined by their moral consistency or lack thereof. In literature, characters who apply different standards to themselves than to others are often portrayed as hypocritical or morally flawed. Authors use inconsistency to reveal characters' defects and explore ethical failure. From Shakespeare's self reaches Anglo in Measure for Measure to the hypocritical judges in the Scarlet Letter, inconsistency in moral judgment is frequently presented as a character defect. Let's examine Angelo as an example. In Measure for Measure, Angelo is placed in charge of Vienna and immediately begins strictly enforcing laws against sexual immortality. He condemns Claudio to death for fornication, showing no mercy. Yet Angelo himself then attempts to course Isabella, showing no mercy. Yet Angelo himself then attempts to coerce Isabella into sexual relations, becoming guilty of the very thing and worse that he condemns in others. Shakespeare presents this inconsistency as profound moral failure. Anglo's hypocrisy is more than simple wrongdoing because he holds others to standards he doesn't apply to him. The play explores how power and self deceptions can lead us to violate the very principles we claim to uphold. Similarly, in the Scarlet Letter, the community's leaders, the publicly shame Hester Bryan for adultery, forcing her to wear the Scarlet Letter. Yet we later learn that the Reverend Minister Demisdale in himself guilty but hiding his sin. The liberal critic this inconsistency the community's leaders condemning in others what they excuse or hide in themselves. These literary examples illustrate how inconsistency isn't just an abstract logical error, it's a moral failing that damages characters and erodes trust. Admirable consistency. By contrast, characters admired for their moral integrity, like Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, typically apply the same principles consistently, regardless of personal cost or social pressure. Atticus Finch exemplifies moral consistency. He defends Tom Robinson, a black man falsely accused of rape, despite knowing it will bring social censure to himself and his children. He applies the same principles of justice and human dignity to Tom Robinson that he would want applied to anyone, including himself and his family. Importantly, Atticus doesn't just believe in justice abstractly. He lives it consistently. He treats everyone with respect, from the poorest citizen to the most powerful. He teaches his children to see the humanity in all people, even those society the values, and when facing pressure to abandon his principles for convenience, he refuses. His famous advice to scout: you never really understand the person until you consider things from his point of view, reflects the consistency principle applied to empathy and moral imagination. We should extend the same consideration to all people, not just those we naturally sympathize with. Other examples of morally consistent literary characters include Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, who maintains her principles about honesty and respect, regardless of social pressure, or Sam Gamgee in The Lord of the Rings, whose loyalty and integrity remain consistent through every trial. Literature teaches us that moral consistency is challenging but essential to integrity. The characters we admire most are often those who refuse to compromise their principles even when consistency costs them dearly. Maintaining moral consistency is a challenge of consistency. While the consistency principle sounds straightforward, maintaining moral consistency is genuinely challenging. We must constantly check ourselves for special bleeding, the tendency to make exceptions for ourselves or those we care about. Special bleeding is uh, is a logical fallacy where we apply standards or principles to others but claim we're exempt without providing genuinely relevant differences. It's saying that role applies to everyone else, but I'm different without legitimate justification. We see special bleeding constantly in everyday life. It's wrong for others to gossip, but I'm just sharing information people need to know. Others should follow traffic laws strictly, but I am in a hurry and it's just a small violation. People shouldn't use their phones during conversations, but I just need to check this one message. The challenge is that we're very good at justifying our own inconsistencies to ourselves. We generate reasons why our case is different, why the role shouldn't to apply to us, why our situation is special, and sometimes these reasons are legitimate, but often they're just relationships and rationalizations. Genuine moral reasoning requires the humility to apply our principles even when they lead to conclusions we find personally uncomfortable. This means being willing to judge ourselves by the same standards we apply to others. It means admitting when we are wrong, even when it's costly. It means giving up advantages we enjoy if we couldn't justify extending similar advantages to everyone. This is intellectually and emotionally demanding work. It requires consistent self examination and willingness to question our own thinking. Practice consistency. As you develop your ethical thinking, practice identifying when you might be applying different standards in similar situations and challenge yourself to justify these differences based on morally relevant factors rather than personal preference or bias. Here are some practical strategies for maintaining consistency. First, use the reversal test. When you make a moral judgment, imagine situation reversed. If someone treated you that way, would you think it was fair? If you were in the other person's position, would you accept your reasoning? Second, practice the publicity test. Would you be comfortable publicly explaining your reasoning and having it applied universally? If you feel embarrassed about your reasoning being known, that's often a sign you're being inconsistent. Third, seek out perspectives that challenge your consistency. Ask people who disagree with you to point out inconsistencies in your thinking. Listen to criticism rather than immediately defending yourself. Fourth, keep a journal of your moral judgments and periodically review them. Do you notice patterns of inconsistency? Do you apply different standards in different contexts without good reason? Finally, practice intellectual humility. Accept that you will sometimes be inconsistent. We are all, and see identifying these inconsistencies as opportunities for growth rather than sources of shame. Remember, the goal isn't perfect consistency, that's probably impossible for humans. The goal is to continually work toward greater consistency and to have good reasons when we treat different cases differently. Thank you so much for watching me teaching you this wonderful subject, and we will continue next session, inshallah. Until next time, tata for now.